Scott, welcome to the show, man.
Man, thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in as well. Who introduced us? Was it Terry?
It was Terry Weaver. Yes,
Yeah.
he's the connector of all things good from what I hear.
Yeah, Terry has been a friend for years at this point. It actually came up in my time hop. I spoke at the thing for the first time like 5 years ago. And now here we are. I'm literally leaving next weekend to speak at the thing for like the seventh time or something like that. Like something just
Nice.
absolutely crazy. He's just become such a good friend. He was at my wedding, and anytime he says, "Hey, you need to know this person," I'm like, "Okay, whatever you say, man." And we got to chat a couple weeks ago, and I just really loved your story. I loved your energy. I love what you're doing for the world, and I'm excited to share that with my audience. But why don't we take a second right now and have you introduce yourself? Who is Scott today? And then we'll break down how you got there.
So Scott today in a nutshell is a speaker, author, and coach. That's what I do to kind of pay the bills today. And, I speak on stages all over the country. I coach in a mastermind type format, and just wrote a book that came out in April of 23. So it's still in its infancy. So that's the new big thing in my world. And I've been married for 25 years, got two daughters that are 22 and 18. So, that's me in a nutshell from a 30,000 foot view.
No, dude, I love it. And obviously your book, Silence Kills, I just started diving into it, and I'm just loving it, right? Because I think the art of communication and being able to do it effectively, not only just for your life, but for your business, for everything, is just so insanely important. So I want to get into why this topic. Why are you the person to talk about communication and the art of it?
So in order to kind of understand that, we have to kind of go way back. I professionally was a police officer for 20 years. That was how I paid my bills. That's what I always wanted to be as a kid. That's how I saw myself helping this world. And so that's what I did. I got into law enforcement, and I was in law enforcement for about 2 to 3 years before I realized law enforcement is largely a responsive environment. It's a cleanup business. People call the cops when they're having a bad day, when they wreck their car, when something's stolen. Like, we don't get on the front end of a lot of the problems. And that was frustrating for me because you can't clean things back up to as good as they were before they were broken. It's just not a thing. So I found ways in my career to get upstream of the problem. So I started teaching DARE. I was teaching 5th and 7th graders how to make better decisions. I got involved and trained as a hostage negotiator because we all have our crises. We all have our issues where we kind of lose control. And I wanted to help stop the bleeding, so to speak, to help stop people from making more poor choices in an effort to try to undo the first poor choice. So became a hostage negotiator, got involved in our Citizens Police Academy, teaching that stuff, trying to work with the other 95% of the population because police are dealing with the same 5% all the time. And so I got upstream of the problems, trying to deal with the symptoms, or not deal with the symptoms, but deal with the root problems. And in that, I also became our public information officer. So I was speaking to the media, I was doing media releases. And it got to a point in my career where I realized I'm doing communication almost all the time. That's what I'm doing for the police department. I'm handling all the media stuff. I'm doing the hostage stuff. I'm dealing with the citizens and the politicians. And that's what I was doing. And I realized that I could retire at the age of 43. I started at 23. It was a 20-year retirement. And I realized 43 was still relatively young. And now at 48, it was super young, right? I'm still a baby, it feels like. So I knew I needed a second gig. And around 2010, I got asked by a friend of mine who was organizing a conference that I already attended. She was like, "Hey, could you speak on anything?" Because I had a breakout speaker back out like 2 months ahead of time. Said, "Sure, I've been researching bullying for my DARE classes. Be happy to talk about bullying." And did that session for her as a favor. And the people in that session were like, "Would you come and train our staff?" Because these were school principals and superintendents. I said, "You'll have to pay my gas." Like, I didn't know how this worked. Like, cover my gas. I didn't.
That's how we all start.
Yeah, I
didn't.
sure
I can get there.
Yeah, cover my meals. I like to eat, that kind of stuff. So I went and trained their staff, and their staff was like, "Hey, would you come back and train our students?" So that's when I started researching this whole professional speaker gig and realized that it was actually a job that some people do. And it seemed to be something that fit what I was doing well. So in 2010, I started speaking professionally, taking vacation time from the police department, had 8 years to kind of build that book of business up to where in 2018, I could step into it. And when I stepped into it full time, I added the podcast that I do, I added coaching, and I started kicking the tires on this book. And it took me, sadly, too long to finish this thing. But The reason I wrote this book is my frustration coming out of the police world when I look at the corporate world is the corporate world, when there's a crisis, when there's an issue, could be internally, externally, they tend to shut down communication.
Mm.
And the problem is that doesn't kill the story. That just makes us fill in the narrative on our own, which is usually worse than the real issue. And so I wrote this book to equip people to say, hey, in a cancel culture world, it's scary to speak up. But the alternative is losing 100% control of the narrative.
Mm.
Where when you speak up and talk your way through a crisis and tell somebody, hey, this is going to be awkward. You know, we have to have a conversation about your work performance or our product failing or something. The conversation is going to be awkward, but there's so much fruit on the other side of it. So I just wanted to give people the tools that worked for me as a negotiator, because when I got on the phone with people who were in crisis, it's not advanced high levels tactics that work. It's the basics of communication. Because really, in a crisis, our brain won't do complicated. Our brain understands simple illustrations, simple tactics. And so I knew these tactics worked in the hostage negotiation environment. And I knew they would work in corporate environments and organizational environments every day. It's just empowering people to use them and trust in their abilities to communicate their way through a crisis.
Yeah, and it's so, and it is really is so key. And I love how you word that. Like when you don't speak up, they're going to create their own story anyway. So might as well walk them through it from reality standpoint, right? Like when we connected a couple of weeks ago, we talked about James Franco, who decided not to speak up about a thing that he did, and for years he was just silent, and it killed him. It killed his career, killed friendships. It really ruined him across the board. And now he's finally speaking up, but it's like, damage is done, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't redo that. So I want to talk a little bit about the hostage world and the hostage negotiation world. Like that has to be insanely intimidating and nerve-wracking when you go into that, right? So very similar to the corporate space, right? Talk a little bit about some of, I don't know what you can and can't share, but talk a little bit about some experience that you've had where you realize that you had to be the proactive one versus the reactive one in all these conversations.
So from a negotiation standpoint, there's two scary times in negotiations. One is when you establish communication, and the second most critical time is when they relinquish control. So the beginning and then the resolution are the two scariest times. And that's true in the corporate world as well. Yeah. When there's a crisis and you first open up lines of communication, it's scary. And so I knew as a negotiator, when I first made contact with whoever was in crisis on the other end, and we're called hostage negotiators, we're crisis negotiators, because there may or may not be a hostage, maybe a suicidal barricaded person. So it's a crisis. When I make contact with them, it's not going to be pretty. They're going to yell at me. They're going to threaten me. They're going to threaten my family. They're going to hang up on me repeatedly. I just keep recontacting them. I just keep reaching out and keep showing that we care. Our customers are going to be frustrated with us, angry with us. They're going to cuss at us. They're not necessarily mad at us. You know, the person I was talking to, and I say guy because 90% of the time it's men because we're bad decision makers, right? So 90% of the time, he's not mad at me. He's just mad. And so letting him vent, letting him air his frustrations. One of the best illustrations I ever learned as a hostage negotiator, and I wrote about it in the book because it's that powerful, is in our brains is a teeter-totter. And on one end of the teeter-totter is emotion. And on the other end is logic and reason. So when emotion is high, logic and reason are low. This is why in a highly emotional situation, we're literally not thinking. We're just reacting. Yeah. Now, the next day, 2 hours later, our brain is going to try to make logical sense of our highly emotional decision because the brain has to make sense, right? So what I did when I let them vent and let them yell is I let that emotion work its way down naturally. Because when you let somebody vent and you let them yell and cuss and say whatever they want to say, logic and reason start to re-enter the conversation. And if they're yelling at me, they're not taking out frustrations on the hostages or anybody who's in there with them. So channel your frustrations to me. I can take it. I know it's not personal. And so we would work through that to where we would start establishing rapport, because that was my number one job as a negotiator, was to establish rapport. Because I knew then what I know now, people only do business with people they like, know, and trust. We've heard that everywhere.
Right.
The only way I can get them to like, know, and trust me is to engage them in conversation. and then truly listen to what they're saying, right? And then the other critical time is the ending, when they're giving up their illusion of control, right? I allowed them to feel like they were in control of the whole process. That's part of the mental chess match that I enjoyed, because they had some level of control, right?
Right.
They're not leaving. We controlled that, but they had some level of control of what happened inside where they were. But I've got to talk them through the process of surrender. I've got to tell them, when you come out, don't bring any weapons with you. Keep your hands where the guys can see them. They're going to take you into custody. Just do what they say. They're not going to hurt you. I have to let them know that this is going to work out okay.
Yeah.
Because it can go wrong super quickly. Like if they don't understand the whole process, then it can go wrong really quickly. And then I will tell them, I'll come and talk to you after they've made sure you're safe. And then I do that, because these people have a high level of recidivism. They're poor decision makers. They get themselves in situations like this again. And I need to be somebody who keeps their word. So if I tell you I'm going to meet with you, I'm going to meet with you. And so those were the times that we just established rapport, and we honored that rapport. You know, there were times where it took hours and hours and hours, but time is on my side. Like, the longer they're still talking to me, and the commander, the SWAT commander, or the chief would come to me and say, how's things going? We're still talking. They knew that was progress.
Yeah.
If they came to me and said, how are things going? And I'm like, I haven't talked to them in an hour, they won't pick up the phone. Then they've got to start looking at other solutions, because we don't know what's happening in there if I'm not in communication with them. So keeping the lines of communication open is key to everything. You've got to be able to talk about stuff.
Yeah, you talk about building rapport. I think people, a majority of them, have a problem with knowing even how to build rapport, where to begin. Like, we're not talking about how it's beautiful outside today. How about this weather? How about the rain? Whatever, right? Talk a little bit about some of the skills people can take into their communication tactics to just genuinely build rapport. Even when they don't know, I mean, you didn't know anything about these hostages, but you were able to build that type of rapport. Talk about that a little bit.
So one of the key things of being a negotiator, when we looked for a new negotiator, if we had an opening on the team, we would have officers that would apply and say, well, I'm a great talker. I can talk my way into anything. I'm like, yeah, you're probably not going to be a great negotiator then, because a great negotiator is a great listener. I've never talked someone into doing anything, but I have listened people into doing things. And so that involves me asking good questions. And this is honestly how you build rapport. This is how I met Terry at a conference. While someone else was on the stage talking, Terry and I were in the hallway getting to know each other and asking questions about the other person. So you build rapport by asking questions, open-ended questions, letting people talk, suspending judgment, because we want to latch on to the first 2 or 3 things that somebody says, especially if we're offended. Because today we wave offense like it's a banner. I'm offended. How dare you? And we lose the rest of the conversation because we're preoccupied by our offense. So ask people questions about them. That's the best way to build rapport, and then store that information. When I meet somebody at a conference, I met a guy at the last conference I was at. He said, my son would love your book. He's a communications major, and I think it would be huge for him. And he gave me his business card. So before that day was up, I emailed him and I said, hey, thanks so much for buying my book. I hope your son loves it. If I can do anything for him, please let me know. That just told him that I listened to him, that I valued his number one possession, which is his son. And when I look back on the email, I'm like, that's right. That's the guy whose son is a communication major. So that's a trick for me. So we establish rapport by listening to these things and then working them into the conversations. When I see him again, don't think I won't ask if his son enjoyed the book, because that's a key place that we establish rapport. I have 2 kids. What's important to them is important to me. And so it's just finding what people value and then working those things into everyday conversations, not in a manipulative way. This sounds like it can be manipulative, but I tell people it's like the Force, right? The Force can be used for good or evil. The Force is not the problem. These communication tactics can be used to manipulate people, but it becomes a hard issue. If I'm really trying to help you, then getting you to the outcome that's best going to help you is helpful for both of us, right? The people that I would negotiate with would be like, bring me an AK-47 and a helicopter. That's what you think you want, right?
Yeah.
That's what you think will help you, but it's really not going to help you. Like, you're not going to get out of this. So let's find a way where you can get out of this safely. You can save some face, and you can get the best possible outcome from today moving forward, regardless of how we got here at this hour. How do we make the next hour that much better? So it was kind of forgetting what was behind us and focusing on the best outcome for them. And that was by listening to them. What do they value? What's important? Maybe it was their kids. How do we get your kids to say, dad made a poor choice, but he fixed it, right? He did the best he could to do better once things hit the fan. So those are the things that we work into the conversation to give them a realistic scenario where they can get out of this, saving as much face as possible, and with what they value, leading the conversation.
And you're really talking about building trust, right? Like building trust with somebody so you can then get to a solution, right? And obviously when I think about the corporate world or relationships or whatever, like it's just so key. So what are some tips, tricks, tactics people can do to really begin to build trust, right? Obviously it starts with listening, but what else can people do to walk themselves through that so they can get to a solution?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things we overlook today, especially post-COVID, is we overlook the power of being in the same room, of breathing the same air. I tell organizations all the time, if you have to have a complicated or a potentially difficult conversation with somebody, make every effort to be face-to-face. Because so much of our communication is in our tone and our nonverbals. Only about 7% of our message, according to some research, is in our words. This is why you could say to your wife or something, you could send her a text, say, hey, don't count on me for supper tonight. I'm going out with the guys. And you get a text message back that says, that's fine. You really, the uneducated guy is going to be like, cool, she said that's fine. And out he goes. But if she was face to face with you and she said, that's fine, that's a way different response than that's fine. Like the tone communicates the message. And so when we're in the same room, breathing the same air, we get a different synergy and the game changes. In a post-COVID world, a lot of the people working in our organizations today have only ever known virtual. They've been in the business for 3 years. And so they've only ever done Zoom meetings, which is what you and I are doing now, which is next best thing, right? Because at least we're getting visuals and we're picking up tone. Text message, emails today, they serve a purpose, but they can't be everything, right? We're missing most of our message. So we've got to get in the same room with people. There's things that happen when you do that that just can't be duplicated elsewhere.
Yeah. I'm thinking about when you have certain touchy conversations in life, you don't always know how they're going to react, right? Like you don't know if they're going to understand. You don't know if they're going to be pissed. You don't know, and obviously as a negotiator, you saw the biggest potential, like, which way could this go, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit less when it's like a relationship or work related thing, but how do you prepare yourself for any way they react, right? Like instead, say they get angry and you didn't expect them to be angry. Like, how do you not then react to that?
So I tell people all the time that I coach and that my daughters and the athletes, I was a coach in high school volleyball for years. I tell people, like, you've got to be responsible for what you can control. You control your side of the conversation. You're not responsible, nor can you control somebody's reaction to what you said. At the end of the day, if my daughter comes home and had a tough conversation with a friend or a coworker or something, I'm like, how'd it go? And they're like, it didn't go well. Did you say what you felt needed to be said? Yes, I did. Then that's a win. All you can control is your side of it. And there's a problem today, and it's one of my biggest pet peeves today, Justin, is we live in a world where people are afraid of offending. They're so afraid of being canceled today that they avoid critical conversations. During the George Floyd, the Ahmaud Arbery days, I felt very convicted that I didn't have the lenses I needed to fully understand the situation. And so I purposefully scheduled conversations with my Black friends. We had coffee. I went to their house. I sat on their porch. And these were the most beautiful conversations I've ever had, because I wasn't asking them to speak for the Black community. I said, tell me your perspective on this. Help me understand from your point of view, and I'll help you understand from a police officer's point of view or a retired police officer's point of view. And at the end of this, we'll both have learned something. And there was some times where I said things I shouldn't have said, or they said things they didn't fully understand. And we lovingly corrected each other. And we knew it wasn't out of malice, it was out of ignorance. And we corrected that ignorance and we moved on. When I shared these conversations from stages and on my podcast, the only pushback I got was from my white friends who were offended on behalf of people who weren't offended. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
They're telling me you shouldn't be having those conversations because that's not sensitive of you. And it really, really bothered me because I think today in the racial conversation, in the mental health conversation, these are the conversations that the world is telling us don't talk about that. And those are the areas in the world today that are struggling the most.
Yeah.
And I believe it's because they've become something in a good-natured effort to not offend anybody. We're offending people because we won't talk about it. We'll tap dance around an issue and make it awkward when it doesn't have to be. I tell my girls when they were teenagers, and the youngest is still 18, I'm like, if you bump up against awkward and you pull back, you're going to miss the awesome that's on the other side. Like you have to push through awkward to find the awesome. In those conversations with my friends, there were some awkward moments, but on the other side of it, there was beauty. And I wouldn't trade those conversations for anything. And I'm not going to let the few tell me what I can and can't talk about. From a business organization standpoint, if somebody on my team is not performing, it would be less awkward to not call them on it, to just let it go, pick up their slack, that kind of stuff. But the problem is if I don't, that's actually unloving to them. If I don't pull them in when it's small and say, hey, I want you to be super successful here. And in order to do that, we need to make sure we're getting these things done. And I say we because they're on my team. It's my responsibility, right? And in order for you to be successful, we need to make sure we're doing these things. And that's an awkward conversation, but it's the most loving thing I can do for them, because the alternative is to let them continue to not perform to a point where I get to a point where I'm like, you're just not a good fit and you're out. When I could have course corrected that along the way. And that's actually a better way to lead. And they may leave that meeting not real happy with me.
Right.
But the next day they might come in and say, you know what? Nobody's ever told me that before. Nobody's ever corrected me. I'm like, I want you to be successful here. I really do. And if I've done all of those things and they're still not, then the most loving thing I can do is set them free to be successful someplace else.
Yeah.
Right. Because I've done everything I could to make them successful here and they're not. We've had the awkward conversations. I didn't shy away from them because honestly, I wanted what's best for them. And if they're not performing here, what's best for them is to not be here anymore.
Yeah, that's huge. And I love how you approach the George Floyd thing. I did the same thing, by the way. I sat down with my Black friends and had that conversation, and out of from my own standpoint, pure curiosity. Obviously, I'm not a retired police officer, so my standpoint was different.
Right.
And it is so true when you understand, when you pay attention to who's offended these days. Right.
Yes.
Like there was a protest outside of our local police station at that time. They were all middle-aged white women. All of them.
Yes.
And you're like, that's so fascinating to see that, right? And it's almost like a virtue signaling type of thing, right? But I think when you have a conversation like we're having right now about those individuals, it's good to point it out. It's like, look at yourself for a second and say, how can I make this better?
Right.
Instead of, and communicate through it versus, taking the stance of don't talk about that, cancel this, do that. It's just absolutely amazing. Now, you mentioned in the book, and I haven't gotten there yet as I'm reading it, but you talk about the secret superpower of a great communicator. I'd love to hear what that is from your standpoint, and we can dive into that if you want.
To me, the secret sauce, and one of the things I say in the book is we do business at the speed of rapport. We've kind of talked about rapport and how important that is, but that's everything. I mean, people don't leave businesses, they leave individuals, they leave team members, they leave bosses who aren't holding them to high standards, who will sanction incompetence, because we don't have these difficult conversations with people on the team. If I know the number one salesperson on my team is just kind of a jerk, why do I want to work there? I don't want to be a jerk. I want to be successful. But if that's what successful looks like, I'm not going to work there. And having those difficult conversations, building rapport with your team. I talk to leaders all the time that say, it's not my business what they do on the weekends. Okay. But if you think what they did on the weekend doesn't affect their Monday morning performance, you got another thing coming. If they work in a place where these people don't care about me, they don't know my family, they don't know what I value, they're not going to stick around for long. When I had officers on my team, I had a school resource officer that I supervised who told me, he's like, I really think I want to be a detective. I said, well, that's unfortunate because you're an incredible school resource officer, right? But if that's what you want, I will make sure that your required training every year is geared towards being a detective, because you'll actually use those skills while you're a school resource officer. But I also want you to be feeling like you're focusing on the next step. And today he's a detective, and he's an incredible detective because he's one of those guys that whatever he does, he's going to be incredible at it. But as his supervisor, it would have been very easy for me to say, yeah, I'm not sure that a detective's thing is for you. We should just stay here in this box that you fit so nicely in.
Yeah.
So I think we have to establish rapport with those we work with. I knew their families. I knew their kids. Every Christmas, I bought them a gift, and it was always a book, and it was always about non-police stuff. It was Uncommon Marriage by Tony Dungy. It was The Total Money Makeover by Dave Ramsey. It was books for the rest of their life. And I did that because I wanted the rest of their life to be as good as they were at work. And then the back end payoff, which is not why I did this, if their finances and their marriage is good, they're going to be better at work, right? That's a side benefit. In the Western world, we like to put things in boxes, like your home box and your work box and your church box. And there's no boxes, right? It's all interconnected. And so when we start focusing on the whole individual and we build rapport with them, or we send a thank you note to their spouse, they're killing it at work. I'm so thankful that they're working here, that kind of stuff. It goes a long way to establish rapport. And that is how we get things done. And once again, it feels manipulative, and it can be, but if I really want them to be successful, then they have to feel like they're working in a place that cares for them.
Are you a big believer in that saying, how you do one thing is how you do everything?
Yes. That, and one of my other favorite sayings is Andy Stanley said, do for one what you wish you could do for everyone, right? I can't go way above board for everybody, but I can for one person, right? And if the other people see me doing that for one, then they know that's in something that I do, and maybe it'll be their turn next. But if it's not, they're super happy for this person who it is their turn. Yeah. That's why we do what we do sometimes. We can't do that for everybody, but I can do for one. Somebody needs, a week off because their wife just had a baby. I can't obviously give everybody a week off, but your wife didn't just have a baby, right? Yeah. So I'm going to happily give you the week off. I'll work your school. I'll work your assignment, whatever that is while you're gone. We have a tragedy or something, we'll come together and we'll take care of it together. And I wrote about that in the book. I was in the honor guard, and, sadly we had an officer killed in the line of duty, and I became the family liaison because I was a negotiator and a good communicator, and my boss knew I built rapport with people. And so working with the family, we planned the funeral. We made sure that all of his family's needs were met. He had 3 kids, the oldest in middle school. And the hardest part for that whole thing is once we completed the graveside service, my oldest daughter was 15 at the time. My job was done for that day. And she came up to me in my honor guard uniform and just fell into my arms crying, like just crying, because she knew, had the tables been reversed, had that been me that had been killed, wearing the same uniform that Burke was wearing when he was killed, that Burke would have been caring for her and her sister and my wife. Like, that's the kind of rapport we're talking about here. Like, we see in ourselves other people's story. And she saw how quickly things can change. He had kissed his wife and kids that morning when he went off to work, and he just didn't come home. And for a 15-year-old, that was a lot. And that marked her, and I think in a good way, to appreciate today and take the time to establish rapport and build rapport with people, because you just don't know. And we have tragedies that happen every day. And I hate to talk to people who say, I wish I would have, right?
Yeah.
Build that rapport today, establish those relationships so that somebody is telling good stories about you to your family.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's really, really powerful. And I love how you put that. It's such a great example as to why this skill that you teach individuals all over the world is just imperative. It's imperative for us to live our best life and to make an impact. And I just love how you put it all together, man. So I want to ask you a question that I ask every single person on the show. Look, you went and built a very, very successful career as a police officer, as a negotiator, and so many other things. And now here you are speaking on stages to corporations. You've written the book and created massive success. And so the question I want to ask you is a two-part question. The first part is, what is your definition of success? The second part is, what are 3 things you do every single day to ensure that success for yourself?
Success to me is about impact. It's about, establishing and maintaining relationships, especially with my family. I grew up with a single mom, 2 brothers. My parents divorced when I was really young. And so mine is about establishing a connection with my family. And when I transitioned to this job, I made it a point to be working when my wife was at work and not be working when she wasn't at work. And so, that means we're watching a lot of TV or we're hanging out or doing a whole lot of nothing. But I really try to wrap things up before she gets home, because that's time that we're going to be together. I'm also easily distracted in my home office. When I hear her out in the other room, I'd much rather be with her. And so it's better for everybody if my work is done before the family gets home. High school just ended for my youngest daughter. It's going to be harder now for me to get done what I need to get done. But thankfully, I'm a morning person and she's not. So, I spent those 8 years where I worked at the police department and was a professional speaker, getting up at 4 a.m. for 6 years. And I worked for 2.5 hours before I went into the police department. So today, without an alarm, I'm up by 6 every day. So I've got from 6 to about 10, 11 before she surfaces if she's not working. And so I've got a good 4 or 5 hours to get stuff done. So that's when I try to carve out that time and do that work.
I love it, man. And that's so key too, right? When I think about, focused, right? Like I don't work an exorbitant amount of hours in a week. And the reason is because when I'm working, right? Like I'm not messing around. I'm not doing the things I shouldn't be doing. Like I'm truly focused on the work. So I love that, dude. So I wrap up every single interview with the same question, but before we get there, how do people get a hold of you? How do they bring you into their organization? How do they get the book? What's all the good stuff?
Yeah, speaking of Harvey.com is kind of home base. That's where everything exists. There's a contact Scott button. They can reach out. I'll jump on the phone with them. We'll talk about what bringing me in to speak looks like. silencekillsbook.com is kind of an overview of the book. It's got a promo video. It's got all the things on there. You can navigate to that from Speaking of Harvey, though, as well. So Speaking of Harvey is the main hub, has all my social media channels on it, too.
Perfect. And like I said, I wrap up every single interview with the same question, and that is, in your life, what has been your biggest moment of growth?
My biggest moment of growth was about 10 years into my police career when I figured out that ministry and work are one and the same. I really had an application in hand to be a full-time minister at my church given to me by the guy who was in charge of hiring that. And I was really frustrated because I didn't want to give up halfway into my 20-year retirement, which would provide benefits and stuff. And I felt like I was on my timeline. And I had a friend of mine say, "You're already doing ministry. You're in the classroom teaching students. You're connecting with this stuff. You're doing prevention focused stuff." And a friend of mine who was a full-time minister at the time, he told me, he goes, "Scott, when I sit next to somebody on a plane and they say, 'What do you do?' and I tell them I'm a pastor, they quit talking to me. And they apologize for all of the cussing they did before they found out I was a pastor." He goes, "You sit down next to somebody and say you're a police officer, you can do more ministry than I can do, because they'll actually listen to you and they'll talk to you and you bring cool stories." And so I finished my career with that focus. How do I finish strong and step into the next thing, which is 100% a business? I'm not a nonprofit. Like I'm 100% for profit. Please give me all the money, right? Because I really honestly don't apologize for doing the good that I feel like I'm doing. And I feel like you should be paid for helping people. And so reconciling what ministry actually is really kind of changed my life and set me up for the growth that I have today. And I feel like that's why I am where I am, because you don't have to work for a church in order to be about ministry. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, that makes total sense, man. I love that you shared that. So thank you so much. Dude, this conversation has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing this with my audience, but even more importantly, doing the work that you do in the world. Because again, I do really believe this information is game changing for so many people to be able to go live the life that they're destined to live and become the person they're destined to be. So thank you so much.
I'm honored, Justin. Thank you.